Good morning. Welcome to King's Report News Hour for the 17th day, now in the 10th month, in the 16th year of Changi. This is Tim Elder sitting in for the second king of Chengdu, Kyungjin-mun. Let's go see what's going on around the kingdom right now in Chongpyeong, Tennessee. We have 36 degrees, mostly cloudy, and remaining mostly cloudy during the day. Today, 48 degrees for high. Tonight, mostly cloudy still, and a low of 28. Father's hometown, Cheongju in Pyongan, North Pyongan Province, and Korea, cloudy and 30 degrees, becoming clear, low of 24. Tomorrow, sunny. Tomorrow, I'm sorry, partly sunny, and a high of 44. And then in northeast Pennsylvania at the Chernihiv Palace, mostly cloudy and 21. A few flurries, morning flurries, otherwise mostly cloudy and not as cold today. High of 39. Tonight, mostly cloudy and low of 25. And in Limestone County, Texas, at the Liberty Rock Parking Campground, clear and 38 degrees, pleasant with some clouds today, then some sunshine, a high of 67 tonight, clear and low of 49. And at the Suncheon Palace in Korea, 36 degrees and clear, and remaining clear through the night, a low of 35. Tomorrow, some sun, then turning cloudy, high of 64. Gunma Palaces in Japan, clear and 41, clear and chilly tonight, and low of 31. Tomorrow, pleasant with plenty of sun, high of 61. And in Guangzhou, Guangdong Province, China, 73 and clear, and also clear through the night, 61 degrees for a low. Tomorrow, warm, plenty of sunshine, high of 82. All right, let's go to Father's Word. Here we are. Let's see, here we're in the book on the true God, the first book in Cheonseongeon, and we're in chapter 4, and the title of chapter 4 is "The God Seen by True Father." God seen by True Father, and in chapter 4 we are in section 6, section 6.2. Section 6.2. This paragraph here, one, two, third paragraph in this section. So, 나이가 들어 눈물이 모두 메마른 70의 할아버지가 되어 있는데도 아무도 그 슬픔의 눈물이 흐르는 것을 멈추게 할 수 없는 어려움을 가지고 있습니다. 그러한 부모가 있다는 것을 잊어서는 안 됩니다. Okay. So as I mentioned yesterday, translating Korean, many times, usually you want to start at the end, not at the beginning. So let's do that here as well. So he says, I'm holding, I have a loneliness. I have a loneliness where no one can stop. No one can stop tears of sadness from flowing from my eyes, even though I'm now 70 years old, and all the tears have dried up. In other words, I have no more tears to shed. I'm 70 years old. I'm old. I have no more tears to shed, and yet these tears of sadness continue to flow, and no one is able to stop them. And that's how he describes the loneliness that he has. And then the second sentence here, 그러한 부모가 있다는 것을 잊어서는 안 됩니다. You must never forget that you have such a parent, or that such a parent exists, or that you have such a parent. Okay. Do you suppose Father continues to shed tears in spirit world? I suppose he does. Yes, sure he does. In fact, I'm sure he does. Those are the words were spoken in 1988, October 1988. And you might say, well, wait a second, he was only 68 then. But first of all, in 1988, by Korean count, he would have been 69. And in October, he would have been about to turn or about to become 70 in Korean age. So I think that's why he described himself as being 70 years old. Excuse me. Oh, look at that. My 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 tumbler here is green, same color as the backdrop, and so it's invisible. That's funny. Okay. All right. Let's see what's going on. So, the U.S. has put out a new national security strategy. Let's look at that and see what that is about. Okay. National security strategy. And, as I look at this just briefly, China, and I guess Europe as well, but especially China, always trying to remind the United States that it's now a multipolar world. And I think this national security strategy says, yes, that is true. And therefore, and we'll see what that so what it says here, but slams Europe. Monroe Doctrine, I think, is something that we learned probably in about the eighth grade, pretty early on in our learning of U.S. history. Anyway, Reuters. Uh, Interesting that it falls to Reuters to explain the Monroe Doctrine. But anyway, the United States will reassert dominance in the Western Hemisphere, building military strength in the Indo-Pacific, and possibly reassess its relationship with Europe. President Donald Trump said on Friday in a sweeping strategy document that seeks to reframe the country's role in the world. The national security flexible realism and argued that the U.S. should revive the 19th Washington zone of influence. It also warned that Europe faces civilizational erasure and must change course. And of course, declaring, well, this wasn't, that was half of what the Monroe Doctrine did. I think usually if we wrote that on a test, we'd get about probably half credit. The important part that we were taught anyway in the American educational system is that it told the European powers of the time, of the late, what was it, did I say 19th century? Yeah, I go early 19th century, basically telling the European powers, such as France, out of the Western Hemisphere, that the U.S. would handle the Western Hemisphere, and you guys can just stay over there and not bother us over here. That's basically, I think, what we were taught about the Monroe Doctrine. The document is the latest and clearest expression of Trump's desire to shake up the post-World War II order led by the United States, built on a network of alliances and multilateral groups, and redefine it through his America First lens. It's interesting that China recently sent a message to the U.S. saying that, hey, we need to protect the post-World War II order, referring, of course, to Japan, and calling on the United States to keep Japan in place and remind Japan that it was a loser during in World War II. Now, President Trump, of course, as this article says, it has done a series of things to shake up that post-World War II order. I think that is worrying China. President Trump's foreign policy is pragmatic without being pragmatist, realist without being realist, principled without being idealistic, muscular without being hawkish, and restrained without being dovish, the 29-page document says. Muscular. Huh? It is motivated above all by what works for America. The paper, which is released by every new administration and guides the work of many government agencies, said Trump would restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere and puts the region at the top of the administration's foreign policy priorities. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is a common sense and potent restoration of American power and priorities consistent with American security interests, the document says, suggesting that the large U.S. military buildup in the region is not temporary. Right. Of course, in the early 19th century, when Monroe was president and came out with this doctrine, it was the European powers that he was specifically worried about. But I wonder, by referring to the Monroe Doctrine now, is the Trump administration uh, pointing its finger at China, saying, "Hey, China, stay out of." But China already has its claws pretty deep into the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela, Panama, some of these South American countries, well, Brazil, for example, preeminent among them, and others as well. And well, Canada, Canada is. So anyway, we'll take a look at some of the opinion pieces on or analyses of this. Since taking office in January, critics have said Trump's rhetoric evokes modern day imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. He spoke early on in vague terms of retaking the Panama Canal and annexing Greenland and Canada. More recently, the growing U.S. military presence in the Caribbean and threats of land strikes in Venezuela and in other countries where drug cartels operate have added to concerns in a region where Washington has a troubled history of military interventions. Yeah, well, that is certainly true. There is a troubled history of military intervention. Well, there is a history. The United States has sent more than 10,000 troops to the Caribbean, along with an aircraft carrier, warships, and fighter jets. The new national security strategy points out pretty clearly that we're not going to go back to the way things were, said Jason Marchak, a senior Latin America analyst with the Atlantic Council think tank in Washington. The document also alludes to China. That's what I thought. Growing economic clout in Latin America, which has been of concern to successive U.S. administrations, and the goal of countering that. In Asia, the document says, Trump aims to deter conflict with China over Taiwan and the South China Sea by building up U.S. and allies' military power. Deterring a conflict over Taiwan, ideally by preserving military overmatch, is a priority, according to the document. The issue has been an irritant in U.S.-China relations for years, but Trump has a history of unconventional foreign policy moves, making it hard to predict how this formalization of national security themes could translate into concrete actions. Well, uh, I was uh, out and about today in the city where I live, and a huge shopping and entertainment center that we have here in town. And I was thinking I think that probably in the next 4 to 5 years, the issue of the withdrawal of U.S. forces is going to come up. And I think I've said this before, that Lee Jae-myung, when he asked for the ability to build nuclear-powered submarines, had in mind that this would be a step towards a situation where Korea could go to the U.S. and say, hey, you know what? We can take it over. We can take things on from you now. We're able to defend ourselves now, and U.S. forces can withdraw. Thank you very much. And the U.S. says, well, no, no, no. We want to keep U.S. forces in Korea so as to counter China. And Korea will say, well, no, we don't want that because we want to be friends with China, and we don't want your bases in Korea to be targeting China. And this kind of discussion coming up perhaps the next 3, 4 years from now, maybe 5 years from now. And now this, where U.S. is now concentrating on the Western Hemisphere, but also it says here in Asia, aiming to deter conflict with China over Taiwan and the South China Sea by building up U.S. and allies military power. So that would seem to contradict that notion. But we will see. We will see. Of course, also depends what happens in China over the next 3 to 4 years. Uh, who knows what's going to happen in China? Whether Xi will survive. Of course, the survival of Xi or the non-survival of Xi does not necessarily mean the collapse of the communist regime. And as long as the communist regime is there, there is a military threat against the Korean Peninsula and also against Taiwan. But we'll see what happens in well, what happens over the next 3 to 4 years. Okay. Let's see here. Deterring a conflict. Okay. The issue has been an irritant in U.S. China relations for years, but Trump has a history of unconventional foreign policy moves. All right. So, okay. In the document, the administration took a dour view of its traditional allies in Europe, warning that the continent faces civilizational erasure. It must change course if it is to remain a reliable ally for the United States. Very interesting. The Islamization of Europe, yes. Um, Civilizational erasure, yes. I think that is very much the case. If you look at what's going on in France and Sweden, exceptions are Poland and Hungary because they refuse to allow immigrants who they think are not going to be able to assimilate with the existing culture and existing civilization. But Hungary and Poland to be kind of islands of Christian civilization now. Well, of course, they've got Russia on the east. Interesting situation, right? Interesting situation if the sort of everything west of Hungary and Poland uh, goes the course of civilizational erasure, and only those two countries remain. Interesting possibility. All right. And the document is the latest in a series of statements by U.S. officials that have upended post war assumptions about Europe's close relationship with its strongest ally, the United States. Over the long term, it is more than plausible that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become a majority non European, the document said. So, yeah, that's what I'm talking about Islamization. Some European commentators said the document echoed talking points of far right European political parties, which have grown to become the main opposition to governments in Germany, France, and other traditional US allies. Well, they call them far right, right? But I think you can take off the far and just say they're right, they're correct. They are, they're correct. Yes. I know. That's not what they mean by right here, but if they're far right, then they're grammatically you should not say far right. You should say very correct. The Trump administration, the document said, wanted to restore Western identity in Europe. Yes, I'm sure he wants that. It comes as Trump has used increasingly racist rhetoric against immigrants of color in the United States. I don't know about that. European politicians and officials have bridled at Washington's tone, but as they hurry to rebuild their neglected militaries to meet a perceived threat from Russia, they still rely heavily on U.S. military support. But for how long? The document said it was in the United States' strategic interest to negotiate a quick resolution to Ukraine and to reestablish strategic stability with Russia. Yes, yes, definitely. That is, I am certainly far right on that, or very correct. Trump has a history of making a positive and admiring comments about Russian President Vladimir Putin that have long prompted criticism that he is soft on Russia. Reuters reported on Friday that Washington wants Europe to take over the majority of NATO's conventional defense capabilities, from intelligence to missiles, a tight deadline that struck some European officials as unrealistic. Assessing how regions of the world rank under Trump's agenda, Brad Bowman, an expert of the Foundation for Defense of Democracy's think tank in Washington, wrote on X, winners in the time, resource, and attention contest, Western Hemisphere and maybe the Pacific losers, Europe, to be determined, Middle East, Africa, good luck. Africa, good luck. It's good luck for Africa, I see. Okay. So, and Africa is increasingly becoming radical Islam as well, isn't it? Uh, Middle East to be determined. Okay, all right. Well, let's take a look at some commentary here. Let's look at the Epic Times and what they're saying. Okay. Key takeaways that they say. Okay. The strategy, they want some money. Okay. The strategy outlines a more selective American role abroad, elevating domestic resilience and regional dominance over decades of expansive global commitments. You know, the post World War II system was based on a couple of things. One, of course, the uh, existence of the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Cold War, starting with starting with the Korean War, I guess. Right, yeah, starting with the Korean War, and then extending with the Berlin Wall, which I think came about in the early 1960s. Um, and also, the second thing that is based on was the huge economic difference between the abundance of the United States and the um, well, the non-abundance, shall we say, of Europe and Asia. Europe, of course, not just Germany, but France, England, Russia, everything in between, had all been devastated by World War II, and Japan as well, and China as well. China is still a extremely poor country coming out of World War II, and other countries as well, not really even close to America in terms of abundance, in terms of per capita GDP or anything else. And so the U.S. Um, was taking charge of the entire world, and it was a well, except for the Soviet Union, except for the Eastern Bloc, everything was under the United States. And Father, of course, says that, well, this was an opportunity. After World War II, the U.S. had an opportunity because the U.S. was so far ahead of the rest of the world in terms of economic power, in terms of its military power, that, and also because the U.S. by far and away had a very strong Christian culture at home. Father makes the point that the United States was in a position to unite with the returning Jesus, in other words, Father, and establish a kingdom of heaven on earth right then and there in the 7 year period from 45 to 52. And but anyway, but anyway, that was the situation after World War II. And now, of course, things have changed a great deal, right? Now, other countries have caught up with the U.S. Some countries in Europe are even their per capita GDP is even greater than the U.S. and they live quite comfortably. Um, Meanwhile, also militarily, the U.S. now, of course, is being challenged very much by China uh, and not so much by Russia, but especially by China. And in terms of Christian culture, that has really declined in the United States. So it's a very different world. And so to maintain the sort of the same kind of a national defense strategy that has existed for the last 80 years, it seemed to be, of course, unrealistic. So President Trump is looking at it and said, okay, well, let's consolidate. Let's get back to, first principles, basically, I guess he's saying. And so in the early 19th century, in the time of President Monroe, the U.S. was saying, okay, at that time, of course, the U.S. was up and coming and just saying, well, Europe, we're strong enough now to take care of the Western Hemisphere, so you guys just stay out. Um, and no, I mean, Europe didn't really think much of that. And was it before or after the Monroe Doctrine that the British came in and burned the White House and burned everything in Washington D.C.? Anyway, so U.S. was not exactly able to counter the European powers back then. Anyway, let's take a look here and see what Epic Times has to say here about this. The Trump administration's new national security strategy lays out the clearest articulation yet of a second term doctrine. The United States will no longer act as Atlas with the global order on its shoulders, but will instead prioritize border control, industrial strength, and uncontested influence in the Western Hemisphere while approaching the rest of the world with sharper selectivity. So, yeah, I mean, China, you got your wish, right? You wanted a multipolar world. There you go. Yes. So now stay out of the West. Yeah, I bet they're realizing they should have been more careful with what they wished for. Here are five major takeaways from the strategy and how they redefine America's global posture: reshaping U.S. priorities in Europe, China and the Indo-Pacific, Ukraine, the Middle East, and the wider Western Hemisphere. Europe, first of all, a continent urged to reclaim its own security. The strategy presents Europe as a region confronting structural challenges, mass migration, demographic decline, and political polarization, and suggests the continent risks civilizational erasure if it fails to reverse these dynamics. It calls on European governments to regain their civilizational self confidence and assume far greater responsibility for their own security. Yes, a good idea. But will they? Will they, I wonder? Or will they just sit around and grumble about President Trump and just, but, you France always likes to be independent of the US. So, okay, you got your wish now. For Washington, this means a shift in role. The strategy states that the United States will continue supporting NATO allies, but primarily as a strategic coordinator rather than the continent's default security guarantor. Instead of relying on U.S. troops funding, Europe is expected to rebuild its defense capacity, stiffen its borders, and stabilize its politics. We want to support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilizational self confidence and Western identity, the document notes. We will oppose elite driven, anti democratic restrictions on core liberties in Europe, the Anglosphere, and the rest of the democratic world, especially among our allies. Elite driven, anti democratic restrictions on core liberties. Mm-hmm. The shift underpins the administration's stated goal of pursuing a neglected end to the war in Ukraine, a core interest needed to halt the drain on European economies and allow the United States to reallocate military and industrial resources to higher priority regions. So, yeah, so Ukraine better get your act together. And also just saying, hey, Europe, if you want to take over and keep this thing going, that's up to you. But we don't recommend it. And Russia's going to win this, so it's the best to get out of it with the best deal possible. The document describes Europe as a region that is strategically and culturally vital to the United States, with transatlantic trade identified as a key pillar of both the global economy and American prosperity. Not only can we not afford to write Europe off, doing so would be self-defeating for what this strategy aims to achieve, the document states, adding that it is in the United States' national interest for Europe to be strong and to work in concert with us to prevent any adversary from dominating the region. Beyond security burden sharing, each strategy also calls for a broader realignment of Europe's economic and political posture. This involves expanding U.S. access to European markets, strengthening commercial and defense ties with Central, Eastern, and Southern European nations, ending both the perception and reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance, and pressing European governments to combat hostile economic practices such as mercantilist overcapacity, technology theft, or cyber espionage. But remember, just a little while ago, the Trump administration was pursuing a peace deal in Ukraine that had Russia uh, joining the G7, making it the G8. So he also wants to incorporate Russia into Europe. in a sense. But also, he wants uh, Europe to be strong enough to uh, keep any particular power from dominating the region. Who do you suppose that is? Was he talking? Is that China? No. The common sense would say that he's talking about Russia there. So a little bit of a contradiction, I think. China competition refocused around economic power. Although the strategy affirms that China remains the United States' chief long term competitor, it frames the contest as primarily economic rather than military. The document emphasizes restoring supply chain sovereignty, securing critical technologies, controlling mineral flows, and rebuilding domestic industrial capacity through tariffs and reshoring incentives. Of course, in reality, the competition is ideological and civilizational. In other words, it's between a civilization that is based on Christian values and a civilization that is not, a civilization that is based on Marxist, Leninist values. And the two are incompatible. The two are absolutely incompatible because one respects human beings as being children of God, and the other respects human beings only as tools of the Communist Party, and so only respects human beings only insofar as they support and obey the Communist Party. So the two are quite incompatible, and I'm a little bit disappointed that they haven't made that clear. But maybe there's a strategic purpose in that. Maybe they don't want to anger China too much. Anyway, that is the reality, and I'm sure China realizes it. In the long term, maintaining American economic. Let's see here. Let's do this. The document emphasizes restoring supply chain sovereignty, securing critical technologies, controlling mineral flows, and rebuilding domestic industrial capacity through tariffs and reshoring incentives. In the long term, maintaining American economic and technological preeminence is the surest way to deter and prevent a large scale military conflict. The document states, suggesting that the Trump administration sees economic power as the backbone of deterrence. Mm-hmm. But eventually, though, you have to figure out what America can do to bring down the Chinese Communist Party, and also to look at China separately from the Chinese Communist Party and chart especially I think it's probably important for the Trump administration to look ahead to a China that is not governed by the Chinese Communist Party and see how relations will work then. Recently, I think I mentioned that China, at least in one statement, I don't know if this was really their official position, but it was a foreign ministry spokesman who said that the Treaty of San Francisco of 1952, which officially ended World War II between the United States and allies, except for Russia, except for the Soviet Union, that this treaty was illegal and uh, did they say null and void? But anyway, that it was illegal. So China also is contradictory because on the one hand, they're talking about maintaining the post-World War II order, but then also contradicting or denying the treaty that ended World War II. Well, we'll see. While military commitments in the Indo-Pacific are to remain firm, uh, the strategy calls on U.S. allies to take on far more responsibility for regional defense. And of course, U.S. allies is a reference directly to Japan and to South Korea. And Taiwan, well, Taiwan is officially not a U.S. ally. Philippines, I suppose, yes, Philippines is a U.S. ally, that's for sure. Do they want Philippines to take on a much larger role? Perhaps, but especially this is pointing to Japan and Korea. This strategy notes that the American military cannot and should not have to do this alone, signaling a long-term burden shift that extends from Australia to Japan and South Korea, yes, Australia, as well as to other existing and emerging partners in Southeast Asia. Well, existing partners would be Philippines. Emerging partners, dare we say Vietnam? Oh, no. Vietnam, an emerging partner. Yes, it's possible. Uh, oh boy. Oh my goodness. Vietnam, communist Vietnam. Uh, Thailand. Yeah, maybe Thailand. Who else? Malaysia, no, Singapore, Indonesia. I don't know. Yeah, but yeah, Philippines definitely. Uh, Vietnam, you got to be kidding, but maybe so. Thailand, potentially, I guess. Oh my goodness, emerging partner, Vietnam. Quite possible, quite possible, quite possible. Ah, oh my goodness. Really, because Vietnam, their relationship with China is has not been good, and um, well, yeah, we also fought a war with Japan, but of course we won that one. Uh, anyway, we'll see how this develops, but that's going to be kind of strange. All right. The strategy declares that the United States will preserve a regional military presence capable of denying aggression anywhere in the first island chain, reaffirming commitments to Taiwan and regional stability, but as a joint responsibility among allies, not unilateral U.S. coverage. So definitely, Philippines is being mentioned here. America's diplomatic efforts should focus on pressing our first island chain allies and partners, because that's of course Japan and Korea, I suppose. And but well, I guess they're referring to Taiwan as well, sort of obliquely, in the Philippines, to allow the U.S. military greater access to their ports and other facilities, to spend more of their to spend more on their own defense, and most importantly, to invest in capabilities aimed at deterring aggression. The document states. We will interlink maritime security issues along the first island chain while reinforcing U.S. and allies' capacity to deny any attempt to seize Taiwan or achieve a balance of forces so unfavorable as to make defending that island impossible. Hold on a second. I need to. Yes, but not only that, but also I need to see here. I need to blow. Apologies, apologies. Okay, let's continue. I don't think I have a cold, but no. Okay, there we go. Okay, all right. Making that defending that island impossible. Okay. The strategy also calls for strong measures to prevent any potentially hostile power from controlling the South China Sea. Okay, well, Vietnam comes in there. Okay, that is definitely pointing to Vietnam and to Thailand, Malaysia, uh, perhaps Singapore, Indonesia. And of course, China Sea, of course, being a vital shipping lane that China has increasingly sought to dominate. The combined approach of rebalancing America's economic relationship with China while maintaining a robust focus on deterrence can become a virtuous cycle as strong American deterrence opens up space for more disciplined economic action, while more disciplined economic action leads to greater American resources to sustain deterrence in the long term. We haven't talked about India or Australia yet. Okay, looks like, I don't know. Okay, let me, so, Hold on. The strategy outlines a broad agenda for countering China's global influence, including reducing U.S. dependence on Chinese manufacturing, tightening protections on advanced technologies, securing critical mineral supply chains, and expanding economic and security cooperation with Indo Pacific partners. But then, okay, Indo Pacific partners is going to include Australia and maybe India, but it's kind of vague as to what their roles are to ensure the region cannot be coerced or dominated by Beijing. And Australia, their role, of course, is the Pacific, right? The island nations of the Pacific. It's not being mentioned specifically here, at least not in this summary. I wonder if it's in the actual document. Uh, and also countering China. Well, countering China in the Pacific, uh, and I guess New Zealand as well. Ukraine negotiated peace as strategic necessity. The strategy casts the Ukraine war as a major drain on European stability and U.S. strategic bandwidth, arguing that resolving the conflict is essential for rebalancing America's global posture. Yeah, and this is a piece of garbage that Biden left when he stepped down. It is a core interest of the United States to negotiate an expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine in order to stabilize European economies, prevent unintended escalation or expansion of the war, and reestablish strategic stability with Russia, as well as to enable the post hostilities reconstruction of Ukraine to enable its survival as a viable state, the document states. So, uh, I think the Trump idea right now is to give Russia sort of a carrot, the incentive of stopping the war by saying, "Hey, listen, you can have a relationship with the United States, and that means that we're going to be removing a lot of the economic sanctions, and you'll be part of the G8. Of course, Europe will not allow that, but this is what the U.S. is pushing for. But anyway, with the U.S. anyway, hey, I know why not connect the Bering Strait? No, that's too far of a jump. Okay, let's not go there. Um, so U.S. and Russia having a much closer relationship, and this is what President Trump is aiming for, and that is something that a number of people have pointed to as being very consistent with God's will. Not to be so arrogant as to presume God's will, but appears to be consistent with God's will because Russia is a very Christian, Orthodox Christian, but Christian country, and Europe is not so much, and it's losing its Christian identity. America is still a very Christian country, and so it would be natural for the United States and Russia to have a much closer relationship, and that'll be possible if we can just get this Ukraine thing out of the way. And that kind of argument might, make sense to Putin, and he can sort of put his territorial ambitions on hold at least for the next what is it now, 3.5 years or so, and maybe including the next administration, maybe 11 and a half years, uh, 10 years or so. But that would seem to be a very logical direction in which to go. The document describes Europe as increasingly strained by the conflict, noting that Russian aggression has left European states deeply unsettled, with many Europeans now regarding Russia as an existential threat. Managing European relations with Russia will require significant U.S. diplomatic engagement, both to reestablish conditions of strategic stability across the European landmass and to mitigate the risk of conflict between Russia and European states, the document states. At the same time, the document faults certain European governments for maintaining unrealistic expectations for the war. Yes, they're not going to remove Russia from the Ukrainian borders or what those borders were previously, while suppressing political opposition arguing that this has prevented the public's desire for peace from translating into policy. Pursuing a negotiated settlement is portrayed in the document not as abandonment of Ukraine, but as a prerequisite for a stable Europe capable of reforming itself and resuming its role as a reliable ally. While the document does not outline a settlement plan, it characterizes the conflict as one Europe must increasingly manage, with Washington playing a supporting rather than the leading role. The new approach fits into the broader doctrine of reducing forever global burdens, pivoting away from the expectation that the United States should shoulder the long-term defense of other regions. Okay. So the Western Hemisphere, a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. A central pillar to the new doctrine is a key geographic reorientation toward the Western Hemisphere, with the strategy explicitly reviving and updating the Monroe Doctrine. The United States must be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere as a condition of our security and prosperity, a condition that allows us to assert ourselves confidently where and when we need to in the region. The strategy states, arguing that the U.S. strategy at home and abroad depends on securing the hemisphere first. To that end, the document introduces a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, pledging to block foreign adversaries, implicitly China. Yes, I mean, who else, right? I'm not talking about Japan here. To block foreign adversaries, implicitly China, from acquiring key ports, telecommunication systems, or infrastructure across Latin America. Aha, well, that's referring to the Panama Canal, isn't it? Yes. And any new canal that they may be thinking of digging through Panama or Nicaragua or any place else. It calls for expanded naval and coast guard operations, aggressive targeting of drug cartels, including potential lethal force, and greater commercial engagement to displace foreign investment. We want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets and that supports critical supply chains, the document states. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. What is that? Well, Panama Canal. Part of the administration's assertive hemispheric strategy entails ensuring regional stability and governance to discourage mass migration to the United States and crack down on cartels, narco-terrorists, and other criminal networks whose operations harm U.S. communities. Well, this idea of economic development in Latin America has been going on for decades. I keep having to blow my nose, don't I? I'm sorry. And especially Central America, right? I mean, South America pretty much can go on its own, but Central America seems to have a history of difficulty with this. El Salvador may be the exception that is coming up, or it is developing into an exception, where it's sort of rejecting IMF advice in terms of a Bitcoin, and is building up its own sort of Bitcoin reserve, where it can, and also trying to become an investment center, kind of they see themselves, or at least the leadership in El Salvador right now sees themselves as potentially becoming like Singapore for Central America and for the Western Hemisphere. And it's probably in the U.S. interest to encourage that and to help that. That would help the economy of a number of Central American countries to move away from the production and transportation of drugs to the United States and to Europe. So it'd be interesting to see if this applies to El Salvador in that way. We'll see. Okay, we'll see. Yeah. But meanwhile, we mentioned yesterday that the President Trump is thinking of reevaluating the trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, or putting it under review. So this is also interesting in that context. The Middle East is security commitments without nation building. Okay, the strategy. Hey, there's a new idea. We're not going to do nation building. Praise God. Yes. Hallelujah. The strategy places the Middle East in a different category from earlier eras of U.S. foreign policy, still strategically relevant, but no longer a theater for open ended military or political engineering. The document argues that, oh, I remember how Bush Jr. saying that, oh, the world would be a better place without Osama bin Laden, without, without what's his name? Uh, uh, my brain is failing me. Not Osama bin Laden. What am I talking about? Without the dictator of Iraq, right? I can't remember his name. I'm having a brain freeze. Yeah, so I mean, that was a pretty flimsy excuse for going into Iraq. So um, no more of that, I hope. Pretty ridiculous. The document argues that decades of long scale interventions in state building efforts delivered little lasting stability and often diverted U.S. resources from higher priority regions. Going forward, Washington's approach is defined by a narrower set of objectives: protecting vital waterways, defending key partners, containing terrorism, and preventing adversaries from establishing footholds that threaten global energy security of or U.S. interests. Well, that's still pretty broad. America, in other words, keeping China out of the Middle East, basically what this says. And so here, let's try to see what they're saying about Iran here. Protecting vital waterways. Okay, so the Hormuz Strait, defending key partners, Israel, I guess, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and maybe some others there. Containing terrorism and preventing adversaries. Okay, adversary here is clearly China, Iran, especially China, from establishing footholds that threaten global energy security or U.S. interests. So Iran is not really very prominent in this definition here. Okay. America will always have core interest in ensuring that Gulf energy supplies do not fall into the hands of an outright enemy, China, that the Strait of Hormuz remained open, that the Red Sea remained navigable, and the region not be an incubator or navigable means, right, the Houthis in Yemen, right? Exporter of terror against American interests or the American homeland, and that Israel remains secure, the document states. So Israel looks like they are pretty much, are they the only country that's actually getting being mentioned by name here? Could be. I haven't seen any other country mentioned by name except for China, of course, but that was in a negative context. We can and must address this threat ideologically and militarily without decades of fruitless nation building wars. It continues. We also have a clear interest in expanding the Abraham Accords to more nations in the region, okay, that's Saudi Arabia, and to other countries in the Muslim world, Indonesia, yeah, and also maybe North Africa, I guess. The strategy notes that the shift in American foreign policy towards the Middle East is driven by the fact that the region is no longer the constant irritant and potential source of imminent catastrophe that it once was, and is instead emerging as a place of investment and partnership. Mm-hmm. That's pretty optimistic. Overall, Trump's new strategy codifies a worldview in which U.S. power remains formidable, but more narrowly concentrated. Well, it did mention Taiwan, didn't it? So Taiwan and Israel. Well, I guess Japan and South Korea were actually, they were also mentioned. Okay. It demands greater self-reliance from allies, reduces America's footprint in distant theaters, and seeks to restore national strategy by focusing first on closer to home priorities like border security, industrial revival, and stability in the Western Hemisphere. Right. So, as that Reuters report was saying at the very end, with regard to Africa, it's basically good luck. there's, there's absolutely nothing about Africa, which may later on require a corollary to the corollary. I have a feeling because I think Africa is becoming, increasingly under the tutelage of China and of radical Islam. Basically, it's becoming sort of a competition between China and radical Islam in Africa. Maybe maybe by omitting it, they're saying that, yeah, we don't want any part of that. Um China and radical Islam can fight it out, and we'll see who wins. Maybe that's the message for Africa. All right, and we have one more on this. We don't have only 5 minutes. Okay, well, let's see. I had this was MSN Newsweek, so a leftist view, I guess, of this. Leftist view of this. Let's see if we can just do a few paragraphs here on this. Um, see here, China took center stage in U.S. President Donald Trump's newly released national security strategy, which outlines his security priorities. Okay. Newsweek has contacted the Chinese embassy in the U.S. for comment by email. The question is, will they be able to print the response that comes back? Anyway, all right. Let's see here. Trade, okay. They have a thing on trade. Okay, China was by far the single most referenced country, right? And so forth. Uh, appeared to call for Washington to muster its partners to provide an answer to Chinese loans in the developing world, much of which has been distributed under the aegis of the $1 trillion Belt and Road Initiative. China has recycled perhaps $1.3 trillion of its trade surpluses into loans to its trading partners. The US and its allies have not formulated, much less executed, a joint plan for the so called global south, but together possess tremendous resources, which the document said. Okay, so I guess that is where maybe the reference to Africa comes in. And Pacific Power, talking about the first island chain, but still no mention of the Pacific Island countries, which may also require a corollary to the corollary. Okay. I still don't see any reference to the Pacific Islands. That's a big oversight. Okay, Taiwan, most concerning potential flashpoint. Okay, all right. Okay. Southeast Asia almost completely absent. Isn't even Philippines isn't even mentioned. Pacific Islands nowhere to be seen. Yes, I agree with that. Pacific Islands nowhere to be seen. Okay. But Philippines is. I don't think that's true. I mean, Philippines is mentioned, uh, not by name, but by implication. Okay. Signals a clear intent confronting China's rise economically, diplomatically, and militarily remains at the top of the U.S. agenda for the foreseeable future. Yes, and so to get rid of this stupid thing going on in Ukraine, so that the U.S. can do that. Anyway, we'll see how President Trump's put this into action. But already, the strikes against the drug boats in the Caribbean are obviously a part of this, and the stationing of the Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, the most advanced aircraft carrier in the U.S. fleet near Venezuela, is also a big part of this. And I don't know, that aircraft carrier may be staying there for a long time. It was taken away from the Mediterranean, and well, maybe it's not going back, right? We were assuming that at some point it would have to go back, but maybe not, depending, as we look at this sort of a strategy outline. Maybe having it off the coast of South America is more important than having it off the coast of Italy or something like that. Okay. So we will see how this develops. But the important thing, though, is that, well, I don't see a acknowledgement that the U.S. and China are not just involved in military competition or even trade competition, but rather civilizational competition. Whether the world is going to continue with uh, Christian values, especially Protestant Christian values, dominating, or whether we're going to be governed by Marxist Leninist values. And that, I think, is a probably an unfortunate oversight. And Africa, Pacific Islands, but especially Pacific Islands, need to be mentioned much more than they are right now. All right, so that's all I have to say about that. And so I will see you on Monday. Monday is tomorrow. You can worship in your local churches, and we will see each other again on Monday. And then, so until then, God bless, Godspeed. May His kingdom come quickly.